Today's daf in the Masechet Sanhedrin is daf Samech Aleph Amud Aleph, and we're in the middle of a Gemara that we had a real opening of our Mishnah about how do we know what you're not allowed to do for idol worship? What is the prohibition? So basically, our Mishnah gives away the answers always, and the Gemara tries to figure out how we got there, right? So the Mishnah, somewhat cryptically, basically said there's three different categories. One is if you do and worship an idol in the way that it is accustomed to being worshipped. And that could be as, as disrespectful, let's say, as going to the bathroom in front of it or throwing stones at it, right? That for that idol, that's considered the way it's worshipped. A second way is that there are universal actions that we do to Hashem, that if a person does those to an idol, it's considered to be idol worship. And those are slaughtering animals, pouring out water, pouring out wine, pouring out blood, burning things on in front of it, right? Those were, Nisuch, was also there. So these were categories of things you do in the Beit HaMikdash or in the Mishkan that if you do them for an idol are asur. And then we had and these are for, you get killed for it. Then we had a third category, which was hishtachava. If you bow down, that's its own unique thing. There's no mitzvah anywhere in the Torah to bow down to Hashem, right? It's not something they did. Now, they did maybe do it because it's respectful, but it wasn't a specific mitzvah. So, but if you bow down to an idol, even if that's not the way people normally worship that idol, you're chayiv. So yesterday we had psukim that talked about worshiping, and in addition to worship, which we understood to mean the regular way,
it's not done in Yom Kippur.
I'm sorry?
It's not done in Yom Kippur.
I mean, it's done, but there's not like a positive commandment in the Torah to bow down. It's part of the avodah because it's a natural thing, right? You bow down when you hear the name of Hashem or things like that. But there is, as far as I'm pretty confident, there's no mitzvah in the Torah that says bow down to Hashem. So, we learned basically there's one mitzvah pasuk that says don't worship idols. There's another pasuk that says zoveach lelohim yecharam. If you slaughter things to a foreign god or to an idol, you get killed. So zvicha is prohibited. And there's another pasuk that says don't bow down to an idol. So we said yesterday, well, zvicha is there to teach you the rule. The rule is anything you do to Hashem, you can't do it to an idol. Hishtachava is the exception, and it's a unique thing. And the way we know that is that hishtachava can't be the rule. Because if hishtachava was the rule, it would be saying anything you do that shows respect and kavod for an idol is prohibited. But if that's the case, you would include zvicha. Because slaughtering an animal somehow was viewed as being respectful and very valuable. And then you wouldn't need a pasuk for that. So if the pasuk of hishtachava was the rule, you wouldn't need zvicha. It must be zvicha is the rule. Zvicha means slaughtering an animal. And hishtachava is an extra number, an extra case. Ask the Gemara now, 4 lines from the bottom of Samach Amabet. Amalei Rava bar Rav Chanan la'Abaya. Rava bar Rav Chanan said to Abaya, maybe it's not the case. Maybe Maybe in fact hishtachava is then to tell you that anything you do for an idol that shows respect, like bowing down or kissing it or things like that, is prohibited and chayiv mita. Then you're going to ask, well, then zoveach lamali. Why do you need to tell me that you can't slaughter an animal? That's included in the category of doing respectful things. Maybe ligufei. You need to tell you a halacha about slaughtering animals, that the mechashvin me'avodah lavodah, that if you slaughter an animal to Hashem, for Hashem, but you think while you're doing it, I'm going to sprinkle the blood and pour it on the altar for the idol, that makes the animal pasul, or it makes you chayiv mita, it makes you chayiv as if you worshipped an idol. Maybe it needs to tell you that. The Itmars, we learned that in fact is a machloket. If you shecht an animal for Hashem, but your mind is, I'm doing this for God, but I'm going to give the blood over to the idol, or to burn the fats for the idol. Rabbi Yochanan says it's asur, that animal is asur, just like if you shecht an animal with the wrong kavanah, it's asur, but also if you shecht an animal with the right kavanah, meaning for the shame the person, but you have in mind that I'm going to do the next step inappropriately, that's called pigol, or sometimes pigol, and the same way that's asur, avodah zara would be asur. But Reish Lakish says it's mutarat. Reish Lakish says that in fact, you don't derive halacha for avodah zarah from a regular karban. So says the Gemara, Hanicha Rabbi Yochanan. It all makes sense according to Rabbi Yochanan. Because according to Rabbi Yochanan, if you slaughter an animal, the halacha is just like any other animal. Avodah zarah is like anything else. So there's nothing else that's unique about zvicha. So there's no, so the pasuk would be extra. And if the pasuk is extra, it can't be there. It can't say hishtachava is the rule. But according to El Reish Lakish, Boikra, according to Reish Lakish, why don't you need a pasuk to tell you that if you slaughter an animal for Hashem with the intention of sprinkling the blood or bringing the fat for an avodah zarah, maybe that also is telling you that you're chayiv mita, that you get killed for doing that action. Says the Gemara, 1 second. We don't really have an answer, but Matkiflar of Papa, asked Rav Papa when he heard this in the Beit Midrash, I don't understand. You're making a really big jump here, and you didn't even realize it, because you're talking about animals that you shecht for the Mizbeach, whether they're puzzle or kosher, right? Our Mishnah is talking about when a man or a woman slaughters an animal for avodah zarah, whether they get killed or don't get killed. Those things are not the same thing. Right? Rabbi Yochanan says the animal is puzzle, you don't need a pasuk. Ad kan lo ka'aser Rabbi Yochanan el behema. Rabbi Yochanan just said that the animal is puzzle, but he didn't tell you that you kill the person. Avagaber labar ketalo, he never indicated that that person who shechts an animal for Hashem with the thought that I'm going to later burn this animal on the altar for the idol, that person gets killed. So maybe the pasuk of Zvicha is there to tell you, maybe actually the pasuk of Zvicha would be extra and needed to tell you that that person gets killed. Because even though they shechted the animal for Hashem, since they had in mind to bring it for Avodah Zarah, they're chai for Avodah Zarah. And just before we answer that question, which we're never going to answer, Matkefla Ravacha Breder Ravika asked the opposite way. L'Reish Lakish mi ba'ikra. Why do you think it makes so much sense going to Reish Lakish? Again, Ad kan lo kashari Reish Lakish ala behima. All Reish Lakish said there is that the animal is not an animal that was worshipped for an idol, because the man or woman shechted the animal with the intention of for Hashem, and thought, but later I'm going to bring it on the mizbeach, on the altar of the idol. So Reish Lakish said that animal was never brought for an idol. But it doesn't mean that Reish Lakish meant that the person with that action wasn't an idol worshiper. Avagavar bar katalahu, it could very well be that Reish Lakish holds that man gets killed, midi dahavi, just like a mishtach lahar, right? The very classic case that we've had many times. A man goes or a person goes and bows down to a mountain, right? The mountain doesn't become a sword just because you bow down to it, but the person worships the mountain. They get killed. The har mutar v'ovdo b'sayif, right? The har is permitted, but the person gets killed. So essentially, we really don't have an answer. The Gemara really does not resolve this question. Presumably, the Gemara felt that it was a little far-fetched, right? And that essentially the comparison of Zvicha is not necessary. And so going back to the beginning, really the way we learn this again is that there's an exception of bowing down. There's an exception of slaughtering. Slaughtering is the rule. Anything that you do to Hashem becomes prohibited to an avodah zarah, and +1, which is ishtachava. So now, Amrle Ravacha Meidifti the Reika. Ravacha Breder Ika. Sorry, I have the wrong words. Amrle Ravacha Meidifti the Ravina. Right, we're around 10 lines down. Said Ravacha Meidifti the Ravina. The Gemara loves to do this. Let's do a thought process, right? Rava bar Rav Chanan asked Abaye a question and said, "Look, maybe the word ishtachava is there to tell you the rule, okay? Rava bar Rav Chanan the Abaye, which according to that which Rava bar Rav Chanan asked Abaye and said, Ema yatsa ishtachava l'lamed al klal kula. Maybe ishtachava is there to tell you the general rule that anything you do to essentially honor an avodah zarah is worshiping the avodah zarah. So then I don't understand, if you go later on in Devarim, right? The Moshe tells the people, and he says, I don't want you to go off the derech. When you go to Eretz Yisrael, Eretz Canaan, don't become like the people there. And don't ask yourselves, and now we quote the pasuk, Eicha yavdu agayim ha'elu et Elohem and v'aseh ken gamani, right? How do these nations worship their gods? Let's do the same thing. But I don't understand. Why would you be asking yourself, how do they do it? If shtachava is basically a rule saying, however you bow down, the way you worship an idol is known. So what methods are there to worship an idol? The ute mai, what would that be excluding? Meaning they're asking, how do they do it? We'll do it the same way, implying that if we don't do it the same way, we're not truly worshiping the idol. So what is it coming to exclude? The chitema, now you might say that's not a question at all, because all Hishtachava tells you is doing things that are respectful, right? You bow down, you kiss it, you bring an animal to it, things that are considered to be disrespectful. But maybe if you are po'erat smo lezovchim, if you po'eretz, remember po'er means you put feces in front of the idol, right? So you throw your stool in front of a regular temple, that seems pretty, not the way they worship, and you wouldn't be chayiv for doing that. But you don't need a pasuk to tell me that because mishtachava nafka. I would have learned that out from mishtachava. I would have said, ma mishtachava derech kibud, just like bowing down is a way to show respect. Av kol derech kibud. Everything else is showing respect. So I don't understand why Moshe says to the people, again, we're paraphrasing, Moshe says to people, don't go and do this where you say, how do the Goyim worship their gods? We want to do the same thing. Implying that in order to be chayiv for worshiping the gods, you have to act like the Goyim. Well, what would you do that was not like them, that you would have thought would have been a chayiv, right? Ella, because you have to do things respectful. Ella, says Gemara, no, what you would have excluded is the following. Let's say you take an idol which is generally worshipped in a non-respectful way. For example, Markulis. Remember, Markulis is the one where you set up stones and then you threw darts at them, right? You threw stones. So that's not, throwing stones in shul is not considered to be a very respectful thing. So you already have a way of worshiping this god, this idol, that's not in a way that we would consider to be respectful. So what if you came and said, okay, but last week I was at a different cult where we actually went to the bathroom in front of it, right? Let me do that in this place. So let's say you are po'er lemute to exclude po'er atzmo markulis, where you do one action that's not respectful, like defecating, to a idol that you also worship in a non-respectful way by throwing stones at it, right? So you might have thought without the pasuk, that since the way you worship this idol anyways is a way of degrading the idol or degrading yourself in front of the idol. So other ways of worship that are bizayon would also be avodah zarah, kamashmon. That's not right. That if it's an idol that's throwing stones at it, you can't say, I'm going to do other things that are negative in front of that idol. Okay? So therefore, that's how he would have understood. Ella, says the Gemara, but if that's true, Hadamar Rebbe Eliezer, Rebbe Eliezer said, Minayin lizoveach behiman markulas. Rebbe Eliezer pointed out, the Tana, how do you know that if you slaughter an animal in front of markulas, shu chayav? Now remember, markulas is served by throwing stones at it. That's the one where they would set up a tripod and throw stones. Let's say you walk to markulas and you said, I really want to worship markulas. Here's an animal as a gift. I'm slaughtering it and burning it in front of the altar. So how do you know that even though that's not the way you worship markulas, shu chayav? Shenemar, because it says, the lo yizbechu odes zivchehem l'seirim. A whole different pasuk in a whole different context. It says, don't shecht your animals to the seirim. I don't know how we translate seirim in English, but the shadim is usually how we say, the spirits, right? Meaning not to Hashem. Now, that pasuk, Imeno in the Kedarka. Demons, okay, thank you. Imeno in the Kedarka can't be referring to an idol that the normal way to worship the idol is by slaughtering an animal, because we already know that. So therefore, therefore, says Rebbe Eliezer, we use this pasuk, says don't slaughter something, even if that's not the normal way you worship that idol. But I don't understand now, ask the Gemara. If, again, this is all in the if that we had yesterday of Rava bar Rav Chanan to Abaya. If Rava bar Rav Chanan bar Abaya was correct, that the way you learn everything else is shtachava, then shelo kedarka means shtachava nafka. Why can't I learn now that slaughtering an animal, even if it's not the normal way to worship that idol, since it's a respectful act, it's like bowing down. And if you're chayav from bowing down, and that's the paradigm for the whole rule, so too should you be chayav for slaughtering. What does Rebbe Eliezer need this whole pasuk for? Answers the Gemara, hatam bizoveach lahachis. That's very different. It's talking about a case where you slaughtered an animal to anger the god, right? Basically, you brought the animal to in front of, this is a little questionable how exactly you do this, right? But basically, you took the animal and you have no interest in worshiping the god. You're just trying to show that you're like, it's like eating McDonald's, the hachis, we say, right? You're basically coming to say, I don't care about the Torah. I don't care about mitzvot. I'm going to bring an animal and slaughter in front of this foreign god, right? You have no interest in worshiping that avodah zarah, right? So you're actually not worshiping it, but your interest is in showing that you don't care about the mitzvot, let's say. So that obviously is a bad thing, but it's not necessarily avodah zarah, right? So you might have thought that's not avodah zarah, and you're not chayiv mita. You don't kill that person. Says Rabbi Eliezer, absolutely not. You do kill the person because any action of slaughtering an animal in front of an avodah zarah is considered to be worship of that avodah zarah, and that is what we learn from the pasuk of lo yizbechu od as if lehem l'seirim. So that's that case. Now continues the Gemara. We are more than halfway down. Rav Hamnuna, it's the second to last word on a line. I don't know how to give a better context than that. But Rav Hamnuna, this is a very interesting story. Rav Hamnuna irchasu leituri. Rav Hamnuna lost his shor, his cow ran away. So of course he had to go search for his cows. Pagabe Rabba. Now on the way looking for the cows, he bumped into Rabba. Now Rabba said to him, "Wait, I know you're running to find your cows, but I have a Mishnah that's really problematic. So can you stop for a minute and help me out?" And he did. He said, I have a contradiction in two Mishnayot. Because our Mishnah that we learned yesterday, look at the top line of Daf Samach Amibet, Tanan, it says, Ha'oved avodat kochavim, a person who worships an idol. Worship is a verb, right? Oved in omerlo, meaning you have to worship the idol to be killed. If you just say, I accept this idol, I love the idol, I worship I subjugate myself to the idol, etc., you're not chayav. It's not words, it's action. Okay, so that is a Mishnah that we had yesterday. However, Ha'anantzan, we're going to learn a Mishnah a little bit later in the end of this parak in Daf Samach Zayin, right, where the Mishnah says, how does a person do hasata? Remember, hasata is where you try to convince other people to worship idols, right? And that Mishnah says, Ha'omer, someone who says, Evod, let us go and worship the idol. Or Elech ve'evod, right? Or Evod means let's worship the idol. Elech ve'evod, let us go and worship the idol. Or Ne'elech ve'nevod, Elech means I will go. I will go and worship the idol. Ne'elech ve'navod, let us go and worship the idol. In all of these cases, the Mishnah says you're chayiv and you get killed, right? So I don't understand. If our Mishnah implies that you're only chayiv if you do the act, the later Mishnah implies that as soon as you say, I'm going to go do the act, then you're already chayiv because you're accepting that you're going to worship the idol. So how do you reconcile these two Mishnayot? And sorry about your cows, but how do you reconcile these two Mishnayot? So Amar Lei, so Rabba said back to him, Rabba asked this question of Hamnuna. Rav Hamnuna said back to him, where am I? The Omer eno mekabalai ela b'avodah. No, our Mishnah is referring to where a person said, look, I'm really flirting with this God, right? I'm really thinking about joining the cult of whatever. But, I'm not really committed until I go and do the action for myself. So meaning, I want to go worship it, but I'm not really accepting until I want to go see what the feeling is like. I want to see, the emotion. So I'm not mikabel it until I worship it. And therefore, although usually if a person says, I want to accept this God, that's accepting the God and they get killed. In our Mishnah, it's where they said, I'm only doing it with action. So that was the answer that Rav Hamnuna gave. Rav Yosef said, no, I have another answer. Tonight, Rav Yosef said, what do you mean? Tonight, shakaltami alma. You're taking Tanaim out of the world. That's literally what it means. Meaning you're taking out the fact that there are people in these Mishnayot. Tanai, there are different opinions. There's two Tanaim. One is one Mishnah. One is another Mishnah. The Tanya, we actually in fact have a Braita. Omer, if someone says, Bo vivduni. Guy gets up, or a woman, and but the Braita said in male, the guy gets up and says, come and worship me. I am a God. Come and worship me. So Rabbi Meir says, Michayav, that person is considered to be someone who incited other people to worship Avodah Zarah, because he made himself into an idol. And just saying it is enough to make him chayav. Rabbi Yehuda says you're patur, right? Rabbi Yehuda says you're patur. So that seems to be like our Mishnah. It says the two Mishnayot meaning. But says Rav Yosef, Hecha de pochel. No. If they actually bowed down to this guy, meaning he said, come make me your God, and the whole community came and made him their God, everyone agrees that that's considered to be enticing other people to worship Avodah Zarah. Right? It says, don't make a pesel, and we actually read that pasuk. There's different ways to read it, but one way, this was, just in the parsha yesterday, right? But yesterday, that lo taseh lecha pesel, we read it meaning don't make for yourself a pesel, but you can also read it, don't make yourself into a pesel, right? Don't create yourself as a god.
So would a cult leader fit into this description?
I mean, potentially. It depends on whether the cult's idol worship or not, right? If the cult is just sort of convincing people to behave in a way and give me all your money or something, then maybe not. But I'm not that familiar with cults. But yeah, I mean, presumably it would. Absolutely. But remember, the cult leader is not worshiping an idol. The cult leader is causing other people to worship the idol. That's called hasata, right? Kipligi. Now, where did the Tanaim argue? B'dibura ba'alma. If the person actually just gets up there and says, "I have a new cult. I am the god in this cult. I heard the word of whatever. Come worship me," and nobody did it. So Rabbi Meir Savar, well, you're chayiv because dibura milti. The fact that you told people to do it, your words count, and therefore you're chayiv mitah. Rabbi Yehuda Savar dibura lav milti. Rabbi Yehuda says that just words. People talk all the time until they actually act on it. It's nothing, and that's how you reconcile our two mishnayot. One Mishnah makes it sound like you have to have action. That's Rabbi Yehuda. The other Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, who says that it's enough if you just have words. So that was his answer. But that after Rabbi Yosef thought about it a little more, Hadar Amar Rabbi Yosef then said, we're now 7 lines from the bottom, I take it all back. Everything I just told you makes no sense. Lav miltihi da amri. What I just told you does not make any sense. Tafil Rabbi Yehuda, even according to Rabbi Yehuda, b'dibur nami chiyuv v'mechayev. Sometimes Rabbi Yehuda says you can be chayev with just words. It's not like Rabbi Yehuda always requires you to have action. It's not, because in fact we have a Mishnah, or I should say Ditznan, yeah, Tani, baby. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, 5 lines on the bottom, La'olam eno chayav. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, if a person gets up and says, "Come and worship me," or "Let's go and worship," right? Let's say we had that before. You're not chayav. You're only chayav, said Rabbi Yehuda. La'olam eno chayav ad sheyomer evod. Unless he says, "I will go worship the avodah zarah," meaning do it with me. Elech ve'evod, I will go and worship. Neilech ve'evod, we will go and worship it. Right? So you see, Rabbi Yehuda is basically saying that if a person says, "Come worship me," they're not chayav. But if they say, "We will go and worship a third party or a tree or something," then you are chayav. So clearly the issue is not words. It's not saying it is not chayav, doing it is chayav. It just depends on what you say, right? So meaning, where does Rabbi Yehuda disagree with Rabbi Meir? If Rabbi Yehuda says words matter and Rabbi Meir says words matter, where do they disagree about the halacha that we just quoted? That is b'meisit la'atzmo, right? It's where a person says to other people, "Come worship me." The people say, "Okay, we're going to come do it. We'll come tomorrow morning at 4 o'clock, right, or 6 o'clock." So the question is that enough? Mar Savar, Rabbi Meir's opinion is that meisit la'atzmo shamilei. Rabbi Meir is of the opinion that a person who's meisit for himself, people are going to listen to them. People really are very inspired by cult leaders, by prophets, by those who have a great vision that they can sell. And indik amri lekushtu, when they say yes to him, they really mean it, and they're sincere, and they're planning on worshiping him, and therefore just that is already considered to be bringing people to do avodah zarah. But Rabbi Yehuda holds, Mar Savar, look, who in the world is silly enough, I would say, to listen to another person? A guy shows up and says, "I am God," right? Meimar Amri, the people say to themselves, turn the page, "What do you mean he's God? Why, I could be God too. I know how to. Why is he any different than us? He goes to the bathroom the same way we do," right? Meaning, what's the difference? And therefore, when they say yes to him, they're just joking, they're laughing with him, right? They're making fun of him. They're laughing at him, not with him, right? And so, therefore, Rabbi Yehuda says they don't really mean it. But of course, if the person says, "Let us go and worship together," then they mean it. Now, matnitin, now how do you explain the contradiction, though, between the two Mishnayot, since you can't say one is Rabbi Yehuda and one is Rabbi Meir? So says Rabbi Yonatan, right? Rabbi Yosef, sorry. Says Rabbi Yosef, I take it back. The way you reconcile the Mishnayot is that kan b'yachid haniseit. One is when an individual, single person gets up and says, there's 2 different ways to read this, but I'm going to read it one way, is there's an individual who you try to convince, right? And when you try to convince an individual, right, then when you go to one person, you say, "I have this great new religion, I found this thing, come do it with me," and they say yes, then you're chayav, because they're really going to do it. Kan b'rabim haniseit. But the Mishnah says you're not chayav is where you go to a crowd, because yachid lo mimlach, an individual, you can easily convince a person, right? That's what cults do. They isolate people. They can't ask questions. You tell them truths until you break them down and you convince them. V'toy batre, and they're going to actually go through with it. because you can convince them to follow whatever you try to convince them. But if you go to a group of people, it's much harder to convince them, right? Group psychosis is harder. Mimlachi, they'll talk to each other, veloto batre, and they will be less likely to follow up on what they said. So the fact that they said we're going to do it is not really going to be convincing that they're actually going to do it. Now, I'm Rav Yosef, said Rav Yosef Minamina. How do I know this distinction between an individual and a group, right? Says Rav Yosef, because the pasuk says, "Lo tovel lob lo tishma ilav," that you should not go right when a person comes and convinces you to try to do avodah zarah. You shouldn't listen to him. You shouldn't. Toveh means you shouldn't like agree with him, like give him, say, "Oh yeah, that makes a lot of sense," and you shouldn't listen to him, implying that if you did agree with him and did listen to him, even though you didn't do the action yet, you would be chayav. Chayav. So you see that even if you didn't actually worship the idol, but you said, I'm going to do it, that's enough to make you chayav if you're an individual, because it's very likely you're going to go through with it. But if you're a group, then it's less likely, and therefore you're not chayav. Eitvei Abaya. Now, Abaya asked a question on Rav Yosef. Is that really true? Mishani ben Iseit Rabim and Iseit Yachid. You're telling me that there's a fundamental difference between someone who's proselytizing to an individual, where you're much more powerful, and one is proselytizing to a community. Is that true? Hatanya, but the Braita says the following. The Braita says, we are 7 lines, I think, from the top, first word on a line. The Braita quotes the pasuk. The pasuk says, "Ki yisitcha achicha ben imecha." If you are, if a person, your brother, the son of your mother, yisitcha, incites you to worship avodah zarah, says the Braita, you know what that means? It implies one person. But that means echad yachid haniseit, ve'echad rabim hanisatim. That is true about whether a person incites an individual or many, right? So why does it say it in Lashon Yachid? Why does it make it sound like it's one person? Says the Braita, Hotzia Katuv Yachid Michlal Rabim, Rabim Michlal Yachid. The Braita, the Psukim actually go both ways. It in one place implies the majority of a plurality, and one place implies an individual. Why? Yachid Michlal Rabim, it takes out an individual to tell you, Lachmir al Gufo, that when there's an individual who is incited, basically, that means as opposed to a city, which we're going to talk about in a second, then that person gets a stricter punishment. Because remember, that person, right, then gets skila, they get stoned. But lahakel mimono, but they're makil on the money, meaning the property of that person goes to his family or her family, right? It doesn't get destroyed. That's if a person is an individual who does this action of incitement to avodah zarah. But Rabbi Michlal Yachid, but then we also speak about a community, right? Meaning if a whole town follows after an inciter to do avodah zarah, and there, in the case of the Rabbim, we're hakel al gufam, right? Remember that the punishment for that is chenek. They get their head cut off. Oh, I'm sorry, it's hereg, it's saif. They get their heads cut off. Sorry, not cut off with chenek, but cut off with a sword, right? But we're making on the guf because that's considered to be an easier punishment than skila. But we are much stricter on their money because remember that you take a town, remember what's called an ir hanidachat, which we're going to get to in a lot of detail. In an ir hanidachat, a whole city where the people went off the path and they worshipped avodah zarah, we kill them with a lighter, quote unquote, killing by hereg, by saif, by cutting off their heads, but we burn all their possessions. So the pasuk says basically there's some rules by an individual, some rules by a community. But asked Abaya to Rav Yosef, it implies in this Braita that Biham Mildu Dishani. What's different between an individual and a community is whether you kill them in this way or you burn their money. But but everything else, they're identical. And Rav Yosef's whole explanation was that there's a difference between someone who goes to a individual and says, I want you to worship, or I want to convince you to worship idols, and the person who goes to a community and says it. That if you go to an individual and they agree, then that's enough to make you chayav. If you go to a community and they agree, it's not enough. But the Braita said no other differences. The Braita said the difference between an individual and community is how they get killed and what happens to their money, but didn't say anything about their words. Now, Amar Abaya says Abaya, therefore Rav Yosef must be wrong. And in fact, that is not a difference, right? What is then the difference? Again, how do you reconcile the two Mishnayot? One which says that you're chayav for words, and one which implies you're not chayav for words. Says Abaya, it depends. Kan b'niseit mipi atzmo. The Mishnah that says that you are not chayav for words, you're only chayav if you actually do the avodah zarah, is a person who went on their own. What does that mean on your own? Meaning you convinced yourself to worship idols. So you sat down and read and watched, maybe watching YouTube counts as other people inciting you, but you tried to, you thought it through and you became very attached to this idol and you decided, I'm going to go dedicate my life to worship Peor, right? There, even though you think that and you said that, till you actually do the action, you're not chayav. Because the same way you convince yourself to do it, you can convince yourself not to do it, right? You could change your mind. But if you basically doing this as part of a community, then it's much harder to change your mind. You're going along with the crowd, right? So Khan, the Mishnah makes it sound that just words are enough to mechayiv you or b'niseit mipi achirim, when you were convinced it from others as part of a group. Mipi atzmo, if you came to it on your own, mimlech, you can change your mind. You will change your mind, right? The same way you thought it, you'll unthink it, so to speak. But if you go with a crowd, you get into the crowd psychology, and you're garer batrayon, you will be dragged along with them, and therefore it's not likely that you'll change your mind, and you're chayav just for committing to doing it, even though you haven't done it yet. And Amar Abaye says Abaye Minamin Allah. How do I know that that's the case? That sometimes that a person who just commits to doing something is chayiv, even though they haven't done it yet, because the pasuk says lo toveh lo v'lo tishma ilav. Don't agree with the person, don't listen to them, implying that if you do agree and listen to them, you're chayiv, even though you haven't done the act yet. Just by saying, oh yeah, it makes a lot of sense, your logic is right, this sounds like a true God, that's enough to make you chayiv. Ha'ava v'shema chayav. So that's Abaye's opinion. So a person who sort of comes on their own to worship idols, they're only chayiv when they actually do it. A person who does it as part of a group or a mass thing, or they're following a TikTok trend, then they are chayiv just by committing to it. Rava says, now we're up to Rava, second to last narrow line. Rava says, I've got a whole different explanation. It depends on what you say. Idi v'idi b'niseit mipi achirim. Both Mishnayot are referring to a case where other people come to you and say, or other persons, let us, I have this great new idol, try it out, it's a really good thing. And the question is, why are you one time chayiv for speaking and one time you're not chayiv for speaking? Because Hadda Amrle, one time where you're chayiv for just saying, I'm going to do it, right, is where you got like the whole pitch. You got like the explanation where the person said to you, oh, kach ochelet, this is how the idol eats. Kach shoda, this is how it drinks. This is kach mitiva, this is who it does good things to. Kach miriah, this is who it punishes. Meaning you got the whole Bible, right? Right? You got the whole textbook of like the things the idol likes, the thing the idol doesn't like, who brings joy to the idol, who doesn't. Meaning you studied the whole religion. If you studied the whole religion and then you said, okay, I'm going to do it, that's considered to be accepting the religion and you're chayiv. But the others where, they didn't give you the whole details. You're like, oh, this is a great new idol. Come do it with us. And the guy was like, okay, I'll go do it. But you don't understand the rules. You don't know anything about it. Then it's very likely that you're going to change your mind, right? Once you show up and they say, oh, you got to pay money or you got to give whatever, then, people are going to change their mind. So that is where words are not convincing. And says Rava now, at the end of the first wide line, Minamin Allah, what's my reference, my source, that there's a difference between basically how educated you are and your commitment to worshiping the idol? Because the pasuk says, again, this is back in Devarim, right? I don't want you to worship the idols and of the gods who are near you. And it says, right? The ones, I don't worship the idols of the amim that are around you, the ones who are close to you, and the ones that are far away from you. Now, what the heck does close and far away have to do with anything? Right? Why are we bringing that in? Mali krovim, mali rechokim. Why is any of this related to whether the idols are close or far away from you? So Achikamer says Rava, what the pasuk must be telling us is that, look, remember, if an idol is close to you, you know all about it. You know the warts, you know the good, and you know especially the bad. You know the corruption of the priests, etc. When it doesn't really work. But idols that are far away, there you just hear the good, right? Like anything, you don't actually see it. So therefore, what the pasuk is telling you, mitivutan shel krovim, from understanding the methods or the good, but the ways of the idols that are near you, and you seeing, all the hypocrisy and all the things they're taking advantage of the worshipers, you should derive from there what is the nature of the avodah zarah that you don't know about, that you never see, that's far away. My love, and what that means, says Rav Adam Malay, right, where the person says to you, kach ocheled, kach shota, kach mativa, kach miria, shma mina. You see from here that basically the knowledge that a person has of avodah zarah is meant to make them more likely to worship it, right? And so therefore, the pasuk is basically saying that if a person gets all the information and then they say, I'm willing to worship it, they're much more likely to go ahead with it than if they don't have the information, because if they don't have the information, they're going to learn things that are going to challenge their faith in this new idol. And that is why words alone are not enough if you don't really understand what you're committing to. Rav Ashi says, you want to know something? I've got a whole nother explanation. The whole other explanation is that a regular Jew who goes and says, I'm going to worship an idol, they're not chayiv, because they're going to do it until they've actually done it, they could change their mind. But the Mishnah that says that if you say you're going to do it, you are chayiv, seifas b'Yisrael mishumad. It's talking about a Jew who already worships idols, right? They've already gone off the derech. They're mishumad. So then they've already done it. So clearly by saying, I'm going to do it again, you committed. Now, either it's because they're already going to do it again, or because they already know what they're involved in, right? So when they commit to it, they really know what they're committing to, and therefore they're chayav in that scenario. Ravina, it's our last answer, says, I disagree with this whole business. That I actually think that saying the words for avodah zarah is enough to be mechayev you. Our Mishnah said you have to worship the avodah zarah. Ravina says, Lo zu afsu katani. The Mishnah says, if you worship an idol, you're chayev mita. And not only that, but also if you say you're going to worship it, you're chayev mita. So it's not one is excluding the other. It's telling you one case and then giving you an even stronger case, an even more extreme case. And so it's not exclusionary. It is, you're chayev for all of it. Now, Itmar, one last halacha for today, which we're actually not going to finish today, but we're at the 2 dots now, right? No, not quite. Right above the 2 dots. The first word on the line is Itmar. Says the Gemara, this is a very fundamental machloket in idol worship, in case you're wondering. Itmar, let's say a person is oved avodat kochavim me'ahava u'miyira. Let's say instead of what we just discussed, that a person studies the religion, they decide this God is truly, the real powerful thing, and they want to worship the God, it's going to bring them rain and food or whatever reason. But a person goes to worship an idol because they love the idol or because they fear the idol. And that's the way the Rambam understands this meaning, right? Everybody else, most others, the Ravid argues with them, understand that ahava and yira mean you worship the idol because you love somebody else or because you're scared of somebody else, right? Meaning you fell in love with a woman who worships this idol and you decide you're going to have to adopt the religion in order to be with that person, which happens, believe it or not. Or you're scared, or, someone said to you, if you want to have a job in my office, you got to worship this idol, right? So you're scared of losing your job, or you're scared of actually losing your life, right? Or something like that. So you're not committed to the principles. You don't really care about the religion, but you're doing it because you love someone or you fear someone. So says the Gemara, Abaye says you're still chayiv. Rava says patur. Abaye amar chayiv zapocha. You're chayiv because you worship the idol, right? You did it on your own free will. No one forced you, and you worshipped it. Rava says patur because, look, the whole point of worshiping an idol is that you accept it as a god. Ikiblo aleb be'eloha in. If you accept it as your god, you are chayiv. Ilo lo. If you're doing it just for an ulterior motive and you really have no deep commitment to this idol, you're not chayiv. Says Abaya, minaminala. Says Abaya, you know how I know you're chayiv? It's not. Because we have our Mishnah. Our Mishnah said, now quoting the Mishnah, ha'oved avodat kochavim, a person who worships an avodah zarah, and then it continues, echad ha'oved. Now, the Mishnah just says, you worshipped it. It didn't say you worshipped it because you loved it or because you believed in it. You went through the motion of worshiping it. My love, echad ha'oved mi'ava mi'yira. Why can our Mishnah be that you're worshiping it from ava and yira, right? Says Rava says, no, that's ridiculous. I don't think that's what it means at all, right? It could be what we said a whole daf yesterday of Rabbi Yirmiyah. If you recall, Rabbi Yirmiyah was the first opinion, because the Mataris Rabbi Yirmiyah, that what Oved means, you worship it in the right way, and there's ways to worship in the wrong way. So Mishnah is not saying every way of worshiping is chayav, even if you're doing it me'ava or miyura. So the Mishnah is not a proof. Okay, says Abaya. Okay, I got another proof. Amar Abaya minaminallah. I have another way to prove what my contention. The Tanya, because there's a Breita, and the Breita says, this was from yesterday's reading as well. The Breita says, it says in the pasuk in the Parshat Yitro, in the Ten Commandments, lo tishtachaveh lahem. Don't bow down to them. Right? Now, what does that mean? Says the Breita. Lahem, meaning to idols, yata mishtachaveh, don't bow down. Avata mishtachaveh la'adam kemotcha. You can bow down to a person. If you want to bow down to a person to show that you accept them as an authority, not as a god, but as an authority, you're allowed to bow down to a person. You just can't bow down to a quote unquote idol or a god. It says the Breita, yacha filo ne'avad kahaman. You might think that you can also bow down to a person who views themselves as a god like Haman, right? Talmulomar velo ta'avdim. So it says, no, you still can't worship anyone. So you can't bow down to an idol. You can bow down to a human if you're doing it out of fealty, right? Showing that you are subject to them. But if they view themselves as a god, like Haman apparently did, right? Then even though they're a human, you can't bow down to them. So the pasuk is saying, according to the Breita, you're not allowed to bow down to Haman. Now, obviously, says the Breita, says Abaya, no one bowed down to Haman because they believed in the theology of Haman, right? They bowed down to Haman because he was going to shoot them if they didn't bow down to him, right? Haman mi yirah havinevad. Haman was clearly the archetype of someone doing it because they're afraid. Other people who bowed down to Haman were afraid of him. And so the Breita says you're chayav for doing that. So it proves to me, says Abaya, that if you worship an idol or a person who's an idol, because you're afraid of them, you're still chayav. And Rava says, no. The way I would read the Breita is Haman's an example, but Haman is not the example. Ki Haman, like Haman, but lo Haman, not like Haman. Meaning, Ki Haman, if you bow down to a person who presents themselves as a god, then you're chayav. Ti'ihu gufi avodah zarah. Haman said, I'm a god, right? But not literally like Haman, because obviously in the case of Haman, Elo Haman, we know from the story of Esther, we think, mi yirah. People bowed down to Haman because he was going to kill you, like he tried with Mordechai, who didn't bow down to them. You'd only be chayav, says Rava, if you truly fell in love with this person, accepted them as your God, and then bowed down to them. So it's not from bowing down from fear, it's from bowing down from true acceptance, even if it's a human being like Haman. So that is Rava's answer. We're actually going to stop here because this is actually a long discussion, the next proof of Abaya. But 5 lines from the bottom, Amar Abaya, another proof of how he knows his contention that Oved Avodah Zarah mi Yirah mi Ya'ava is also considered Avodah and you're Chayav Mita. I was just going to say, Miriam, I don't know if you heard this before, but
I didn't.
Dov is away.
Yeah.
So I'm going to do the Daf Yomi for him tomorrow. But I'm away in the morning, so I can only do it in the evening. So I proposed 7:30, which I think worked for one. Okay, so we got 2 yeses, and James said he'll come whenever, so we could do any time.
I'm not sure if I could do 7:30.
How about 7?
I would actually prefer a little early. Could we do like 6?
6 is gonna be hard for me. 6:30.
Is 6:30 a compromise?
Okay, 6:30, but I may have to cut out early.
Okay, I'm gonna put on the chat 6:30, unless there's an overwhelming number of other people, I don't know who they are, who say another time, then we'll do 6:30 p.m. tomorrow evening. Join James and I at 6:30.
Thank you so much.
Have a good night.
Good night.
Rather Tov.